On the morning of March 2, 1969, Chinese soldiers rose from frozen foxholes on Zhenbao Island and shot roughly 31 Soviet border guards dead in the snow. The ambush on the Ussuri River was not an accident of frontier tension. It was planned, and Moscow knew it. 13 days later, the Soviets answered with tanks, artillery, and Grad rockets that turned the small disputed island into a cratered ruin. Two communist powers that had once called each other brothers were now killing each other across a frozen river, and the quarrel between them ran deeper than any border marker. It was a fight over who owned the revolution itself, but buried in the diplomatic traffic of that year was a single conversation, a few minutes of silence in a Washington office, that would decide whether the border war stayed small or became something the 20th century had never seen. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The shooting did not stop at the Ussuri. Through the spring and summer of 1969, the violence crept westward along 7,000 kilometers of frontier, from the rivers of Manchuria to the deserts of Central Asia. On August 13th, at Tiliketi in Xinjiang, Soviet forces surrounded and destroyed an entire Chinese company. It was less a battle than a demonstration. By then, the Soviet Union had massed dozens of divisions along the Chinese and Mongolian borders, backed by tactical nuclear weapons, and inside the Kremlin, a harder question was being asked. China had detonated its first atomic bomb at Lop Nur in October 1964, and a thermonuclear device less than 3 years later. Marshal Grechko, the defense minister, argued that this arsenal should be destroyed before it matured, one disarming blow against a program still small enough to kill. And so Soviet diplomats began, very quietly, to take America's temperature. On August 18th, embassy officer Boris Davidov asked a State Department official, almost casually, how Washington would react if Soviet forces struck China's nuclear facilities. The question was making its way up the ladder. 2 days later, it reached the top. On August 20, 1969, Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin raised the matter with Henry Kissinger directly. He expected the response other Soviet probes had drawn, a warning, a frown, some signal that Washington would not sit still. Here is where this timeline breaks from our own. Kissinger, guarding the secrecy of Nixon's overture to Beijing, the back channels already running through Pakistan's Yahya Khan and Romania's Ceausescu, chose ambiguity. He listened. He asked a clarifying question. He offered no objection. For roughly 8 minutes, the National Security Advisor of the United States said nothing that Moscow could read as refusal. Dobrynin was a careful man, and his cable that night was careful too. But careful language can still carry a fatal conclusion, and his conclusion was this: the Americans will not interfere. In Moscow, Grechko had his opening. Brezhnev, weighing a border war that was already bleeding and a Chinese bomb that would only grow, gave his assent. What no one in that room understood, what would not become clear for years, was how much of the next half-century had just been decided by a silence. The strike came in a single night in early September. Soviet medium bombers and missile forces hit the Lop Nur test site, the Baotou fuel and enrichment complex, and the Jiuquan plutonium works, the visible core of a weapons program China had deliberately placed in its thinly defended northwest. The strike was conventional by design. Grechko's general staff had built it as a surgical operation, not an opening to invasion. No nuclear warheads, no strikes on cities, no crossing of the main frontier. The theory was that a limited blow would disarm China without igniting a general war, and on the first morning the theory seemed to hold. The facilities burned. The 5-year-old deterrent, or at least everything Moscow's targeteers could see of it, was gone. But a disarming strike only ends a war if the disarmed side agrees to stop fighting. Mao Zedong had spent his entire life refusing exactly that kind of agreement. The consequences of that refusal would prove enormous. But first, the decision passed to Washington. Richard Nixon learned of the strike 3 weeks before his planned secret approach to Beijing was to move forward. Now he faced a question no American president had ever been asked. Did the United States have a stake in a Chinese nuclear deterrent, the same deterrent Washington had spent the 1960s fearing, even studying how to destroy itself? Through one long night in the White House, the answer took shape. Nixon condemned the strike publicly, in the hardest language of his presidency. He warned Moscow that invasion of China, or any use of nuclear weapons, would bring consequences he did not specify. And then he committed nothing. No forces moved. No guarantee was extended to a country with which America had no relations and a fresh memory of Korea. The overture to Beijing, so carefully prepared, died unsent because no channel to Mao could survive the fact that American silence had helped unlock the bombers. Kissinger understood, perhaps before anyone, what had been lost. The opening of the century had closed before it opened. China did not sue for peace. Lin Biao, the successor designate who commanded the mobilization, evacuated the leadership inland along routes the Cultural Revolution's tunneling and the Third Front dispersal had already prepared. Mao declared protracted People's War, and millions moved. What followed was not the short punitive campaign Grechko had promised. Chinese artillery and infantry struck along the entire frontier, absorbing losses that would have broken any other army, trading blood for time and territory for nothing. Soviet forces seized border strips, mauled PLA concentrations, and won nearly every engagement they chose to fight, and it did not matter. No one in Moscow was willing to occupy a nation of 800 million people. The war congealed into a long, bleeding stalemate, shelling, incursions, ambush, reprisal, month after month, along the longest militarized border on Earth. The Soviet Union had planned a strike. It had acquired a war. In the world that followed, there was no Nixon visit to Beijing, no handshake at the airport, no triangular diplomacy, no Chinese interest in pressing Hanoi toward a settlement. Ho Chi Minh had died on September 10, 1969, and his successors fought on with both patrons still committed, so Vietnam ground forward longer and cost more. Washington now faced two hostile communist powers who hated each other and agreed on almost nothing except America. Japan, watching bombers cross a neighbor's border, began a rearmament debate that a generation of its politicians had sworn never to have. Taiwan's seat at the United Nations, doomed in our timeline by 1971, survived another decade because no majority could be assembled to seat a government at war. The strange truth was that the Sino-Soviet split, which in real history became America's greatest strategic asset, had in this timeline hardened into something unusable, a hatred too hot to exploit, on a frontier too dangerous to touch. And then, in the deep valleys of southwest China, came the development that made the entire enterprise pointless. In Third Front sites cut into the mountains of Sichuan and Guizhou, the dispersed, hidden, hardened industry Mao had ordered built years before the strike, Chinese engineers rebuilt what the bombers had destroyed. They worked with less, and slower, and underground, but they worked, and no Soviet targeteer could find them all. By the end of the 1970s, a successor to Lop Nur hosted a new test, and the flash over the western desert announced that the disarming strike had disarmed nothing permanently. Moscow had bought perhaps 8 years. The price was a war that never quite ended, a permanent enemy along its longest border, a second front that drained the Soviet Union through the very decades it could least afford, and a memory that Chinese schoolchildren would carry for a century. In our own history, this was the war that almost happened until Washington's warnings and the Kosygin-Zhu meeting at Beijing's airport on September 11, 1969, pulled both sides back from the edge. The difference between the two worlds was never armies or arsenals. It was 8 minutes in an office in Washington, and a man who mistook silence for permission. Great powers rarely stumble into catastrophe by malice. They stumble into it by reading, in each other's quiet, whatever they most need to hear.